I wanted to release a solo episode off the back of the storming of the US Capitol this week, because it's inspired me to kind of touch on some issues of suffering in society that I've wanted to explore for a long time, but I think we're in a situation where these things are so volatile emotionally to kind of talk about that a lot of those conversations can get derailed very quickly. So I kind of wanted to go into this talking about why it's so difficult to talk about these subjects. So on the channel, on the podcast, I've been exploring different aspects of human kind of flourishing, well-being, suffering, and the kind of system that we are, the principles that allow us to get captured by suffering or to break free of it, those apply at different scales, and they do apply at the level of society as well, or at the level of interpersonal relationships, families. You know, you can perform the same analysis at those different scales. And what it comes down to is usually the kind of discord and suffering comes about because of an attempt to control, an unwillingness to allow things to kind of play out in a way that would allow the system to kind of flourish. But instead, fear-based situations of control and domination, whether it's your own mind, the kind of patterns you might undo in meditation, where your rational mind is constantly trying to think about the future to try and get a handle on what's going on so that it feels safer, and you're learning to kind of undo that and find the well-being that comes along with that surrender. Or with healing trauma, with psychedelic medicine, usually the mind is kind of overactive, replaying flashbacks, trying to process and get a hold of what happened, and the system needs to learn to let go and surrender and kind of go with the flow. And so we're talking here about the problem being control and domination, and how that comes out of fear. And obviously in our society, power is not distributed perfectly equally. There are clear asymmetries in power between individuals, between groups, and this is the kind of core of the issues that play out in society and the issues that are difficult to talk about. And I think they're difficult to talk about because we are, if you think of us like a kind of, a global human family, these interpersonal kind of perspectives play out in that family, and there is no vantage point from which you can kind of truly step outside of it. We're really in it. We're so deeply interconnected, and as these social primates, we're emotionally very deeply interconnected. You think of the fact that people can say words, and those words can reach inside your body and cause you to produce stress hormones, or change different aspects of your mind and your physiology. We're really deeply in each other's pockets, and so when there's ambient stress and trauma and emotional issues, any kind of ripple in that kind of activates the traumas of other people, making it very hard to kind of navigate in this area. So I want to talk about why it's kind of difficult to talk about this stuff, and I find this family framing to be really helpful. So, I grew up in a family where there was a caregiver who was a narcissist, and in that situation you have a narcissistic family unit where there's this kind of ambient level of stress and kind of psychological and emotional conditioning and kind of abuse from an early age that forces you to toe a certain narrative. So it's a kind of it's like living inside a cult, or in North Korea, where you have to go along with the narrative of the dominant power, or you don't have to. There are certain groups that are scapegoated to distract from what's going on. This could be the individual in the case of the narcissistic family, or whole groups on the level of society. And then the siblings, in this case, the people who are not being directly targeted, have the choice of aligning with the false narrative, with the power dynamics, and bullying the scapegoat, or aligning with the scapegoat and then taking the heat that goes along with that. And so maybe it shouldn't be a surprise, given that I was the scapegoat in that situation, that I feel a lot of affinity for the scapegoats of the world as an adult. So, although I don't think that delegitimizes any of the things I'm going to say here, they still hold together, even if my emotional bias points me in that direction. So, with that lens, the issue here is the conditioning that we're all raised within, and the way that serves systems of power, serves those who don't want the spotlight on them, because we all have this basic core of compassion, And if you can see the abuse that's going on, if it's really showed to you in kind of daylight, well, I was going to say then most of us have this strong reaction where we won't let it continue. But part of the reason I wanted to make this video is because I'm doubting that more and more with what's gone on over the last year in America. And my wife is American, so I'm particularly kind of tied to those events. And my natural inclination is as a peacemaker and someone who doesn't want to leave anyone behind. I grew up in a situation where there were people who were kind of in a community that were very far right and could also see their pain. And so there's this part of me that always doesn't want to just kind of shut them out. I think, we do need a truly global healing that includes everyone. But when you're confronted with the footage of the murder of George Floyd, or the asymmetry in the police response to the Black Lives Matter protests versus the insurrection on the US Capitol by white supremacist groups, those who align with the systems of power and align with the bullies, and against the scapegoats, and refuse to see the inherent kind of white supremacy of the system, the way that it favors, preferentially treats white people. I'm struck by, I guess, a disappointment that it seems that some people are so deranged by their own issues, so hijacked emotionally by whatever the stress is that's going on for them, that they're so stuck in these narratives that defend themselves, this kind of self-assertive scapegoating narrative where they're externalizing their trauma onto other more vulnerable people. It just kind of hits home for me that there truly are groups of people who, for now, don't seem to be reachable. I do think the future flourishing of our society hinges on them being reachable. Society just exists of the humans that make it up. There is no thing that exists outside of that. And so all of the stress and problems we see comes from the psychological pain carried by the individuals. So I do think we need everyone to be included in this healing, but in the past, when I would record a video like this, I guess I would be hoping that I could reach those people. I'm now seeing that people who sympathize with that perspective are just not, there's not going to be any productive communication, I think. I don't think they're going to hear what I'm saying, if they were listening to this. So that motivated me to kind of, I guess, plant a flag and kind of lay out my perspective. And so with the issue of the difficulty of talking about this stuff and the analogy between a kind of narcissistic family and a narcissistic society, not in the sense of obsessed with its ego, but I'll be talking to people about experts on narcissism this year to get into it because it's quite a complex thing, but it's to do with this kind of system of self-protection through domination. And the way that this propagandizing is one of the main tools that's used as a tool of power. We see this with a phrase like white supremacist, right? If you say that the entire system of a country like the UK or America is white supremacist, a claim like that comes from the deep history. You can't doubt the existence of kind of slavery and the involvement of both the UK and America, and colonization. And there are people who look at that and want to pretend that's entirely in the past and that there is no momentum carrying forward from that. And that partly comes about because it's uncomfortable to be reminded of that stuff. If you're a white person like me, it should make you feel uncomfortable. Things are functioning normally if you think of colonialism and you feel uneasy as a white person. But the problem is that almost all of us, and probably all of us, carry residues of kind of unresolved emotional issues. And a huge one that most of us have, or again, probably all of us have, is when you're a child, there's this self-criticism, self-monitoring that goes on, where you need to make sure you are behaving in a way that you are not going to be rejected, because in the wild that would mean death. So there's this kind of self-critical voice that we all have that wonders if you are fundamentally bad in some way. Fundamentally, on some level, maybe no one knows that, but there's some part of us that suspects that we might be kind of fundamentally bad. And this is very deeply hidden because, this probably won't resonate as I say it to you, because this is like the core of our kind of shadow side, the stuff we don't want to think about because it's too overwhelming to think about that possibility. But to know it's there because it's a useful, evolved kind of cognitive module, rather than because you are actually bad, is kind of can be a freeing thing as well to face with this stuff. But so for a lot of people, when they're forced to think about something like kind of a culture being kind of white supremacist, it triggers that feeling of, instead of hearing it as the system kind of carries these patterns and the system needs to be modified, they map it onto themselves and they make it, this is really narcissistic in the sense that they interpret it as, oh no, they're saying I'm bad, they're saying I'm part of the bad group. And that's, in part what leads people to come up with these kind of nonsense positions of saying, oh, it's racist to talk about white people having more power in these cultures. And it's a kind of knee-jerk thing that comes from this kind of wounded kind of child part of the person that's very quickly overwhelmed by these claims. And also keep in mind what I said at the start about how we're all in each other's pockets emotionally. I say those words and it's probably having some effect on your adrenal system. There's some ambient increase in stress as I mention this stuff. And so I'm crossing a boundary as I talk to you. I am kind of reaching inside you and causing some effect. And I apologize if it's uncomfortable. That's partly why I've been hesitant to kind of, dive into this stuff head first, because I'm aware that it is kind of unsettling for people to have their boundaries crossed in that way. So I hope I'm doing it in a gentle enough way. But you can see why that produces this unconscious kind of reflexive response where before the information's even been processed, before they even hear what I'm saying about colonization and slavery, it's just this, no, I have to come up with a narrative that says that can't be the case, because if that's the case, then I'm bad. And that's the kind of unconscious processing. And actually you see this play out hugely in kind of anti-progressive public intellectuals, as they would call themselves, but maybe I wouldn't, who make the narrative always about, it looks from the outside that they're willfully misunderstanding, but I don't think they are. I think the same thing I just mentioned is playing out, where instead of having the capacity to hear the systemic critique of the patterns of society, they're so unconsciously concerned with themselves, with their own kind of inner critic, that they have to hear it as they're saying white people are bad. They're saying individual white people are bad, which is not the critique of systemic racism. I mean, that is a critique you can make about any kind of group of people. There are individuals who are bad in any group, but that is not the critique of saying that we're still living with the kind of patterns that prioritize certain kind of racial groups over others. So that happens at the individual level, but then as a society, you have people who group around that emotional reaction and they defend each other. They build narratives where this is where you truly get kind of white supremacist groups who kind of rally together and say, we really don't want to be made to feel this way. I mean, that's not what their actual kind of conscious narrative is, but that's kind of the unconscious thing that's playing out. And so they rally together, they come up with kind of nonsense narratives, and then in this case, they stormed the US Capitol. But when that plays out at a large enough scale, you start to get these kinds of institutionalized narratives as well that justify, I mean, this is what colonization is, right? The people who perpetrated that clearly did see themselves as superior, or at least were lacking in empathy enough to do what they did. And so we're raised inside the situation where we have this kind of narrative, and you then have to make you're conditioned, no matter what, in this narrative, and then it's up to you as to whether you're going to side with the scapegoats, do all the deconditioning. Like even when I say to myself that we live in a white supremacist system, we're conditioned to hear that phrase and think it sounds hysterical, think it sounds like an overreaction to talk about the everyday functioning of society as white supremacy. And that's not a coincidence. That's how the kind of system of power manages to, it's one of the main ways in which it keeps power going, because it makes it hard for us to even talk about this stuff. So as these social primates that care above all about our kind of interpersonal dynamics, there's huge pressure put on us to not use terms like white supremacy, not to talk about the fact that it's a white supremacist system or a patriarchal system or a heteronormative system, all these different ways in which domination occurs. So what can happen is there's this ambient trauma that gets kind of ricocheted around in society from these past horrors like slavery and then war and, everything, our alienation from nature. All of this produces ambient stress that gets passed on through the generations. And so we're like the stressed out narcissistic family where even the sibling who's not being targeted still feels the stress and still wants to belong, still has all the basic needs of needing to kind of fit into this dynamic. And so when one of the scapegoats tries to talk about what's going on, the whole situation is so stressful. As I said, you can't step outside of it. You're in it, and it's stressful. So it's very easy then for the dominant power to construct a narrative where they're the bad ones for talking about it. They're the bad ones. They've made you feel bad. As I mentioned earlier, me talking about this stuff, reaching inside your body and having some effect on your hormones, then the anger could get directly turned at me and say, you are bad. Why have you spoken about this stuff? And so that's the trick in the narcissistic family, but also in our society. That's the trick of how it keeps being perpetuated. The victims can't be heard en masse because the majority of people were kind of going to look out for themselves because of the ambient stress level and look out for their own best interests and not talk about this stuff. The people who are the kind of the frontline foot soldiers of this are in the kind of narcissistic family unit terminology. There's this thing called flying monkeys, which are the kind of the intermediate family members who do the bidding of the person who's kind of in the power position in abusing the scapegoats. And so the people who have endless energy to debate these things, who are going to pop up anytime white supremacy is mentioned and dismiss and try to debate the issue. These are the kind of frontline foot soldiers of the system of domination who seem to have endless energy to just kind of suck the emotional life out of people who are trying to kind of talk about this stuff. But they're so visible and widespread now in society in these kind of white supremacist movements that we see, and just in the media as well. Just so many kind of commentators whose role seems to be to prop up the existing system through sucking the energy of people who want to talk openly and honestly about what's going on. So, this obviously, the key issue here is domination, and our economic system as well, where you can accumulate wealth and exploit others, clearly is based in domination. But so I think we need, if we're going to avoid climate catastrophe as well as just the ongoing horrors of the system that we're currently in, of exploitation and abuse, we do need radical change. But I think if one is interested in thinking about what that might look like, I think you need skepticism around any ideology. I think ideology is part of the problem, because an ideology is a narrative. It's another way of trying to control things. It's a way of getting people together and saying, this is our story and we're sticking to it. So it's fundamentally fragile and inflexible. And if there's one kind of ism, a tradition that you can kind of frame this within, it would be anarchism, because unlike other ideologies, it's not an ideology. It's a critique of systems of power and domination and how to dismantle them, how to maximize freedom for the individual and society in a way that's aligned with flourishing, and in a way that where there are no rules, there are no fixed systems of control. But instead you have this bottom-up self-organization, the kind of thing we see in nature, the kind of principles that lead to genuine flourishing. So this is also why I think spirituality is absolutely crucial to any kind of radical change you might see in society. Because if you take something like, communism and like Marxist leftism, that's very rooted in a kind of rationalist, materialist way of thinking, which is part of the problem. Part of the problem is that kind of intellectualizing, trying to process all the information and try to think, here's how we should organize things. And as we saw with the Bolshevik Revolution, if you try to rapidly transform one society overnight into another one, all of the demons that haunt the kind of psychology of that society are still going to be there. You're still going to have the instinct for control and domination, and if you don't include everyone, if there's the risk of the kind of counter-revolution, then you just get the horrors that we saw in the 20th century from every economic system, or should I say both. So this is why, I think my position is the good thing about this position, even though it's a position where it can seem very far off. It can seem like, you could say it needs to come from the bottom up. You can't impose it from the top down. You can't overnight have a revolution and suddenly impose a new system. We need change at the individual level, at the collective level, to a point where suddenly we're just living in the kind of situation we want to live in. And so the way I think about it is you can't have anarchism, you can't have a functioning, flourishing, free society without anarchists, without the majority of people kind of thinking this is a good idea and wanting to live in this way, because the individual is taking it on themselves to organize how society functions and the economic relations that exist. And for anyone who, anarchism is a perfect example of how the kind of systems of domination propagandize, because to most people anarchy means chaos, whereas it just means without ruler is the etymology of it. And the people who are interested in ruling don't like the idea of a system where people just organize amongst themselves. So the kind of lack of ruler is we're told it has to mean chaos. It can't mean a kind of flourishing, self-organizing system. To use a trivial example that I think actually kind of works. If you think of how you get stuff done in a group of friends, say there's a dozen people and you're ordering a pizza, you don't need top-down rules to govern that process. You can self-organize and come to some consensus. And if there are toxic people in that situation, you flexibly adapt to change your priorities to make sure everything's working as smoothly as possible, because it's just instinctively that's what we want, right? None of us want to be living in a stressed out situation of suffering. And it's only through our kind of alienation and stress that we get into these situations where we lose empathy and people are interested in domination. And so that's the fundamental thing that needs healing, is the egoic, fear-based response where we're willing to externalize our own trauma, scapegoat others. And this plays out in the level of the individual mind. Even in the most, saintly person, there will still be aspects of egoic self-concern. And, this plays out all the way to society level, where you have individuals who are very much expressing just that aspect of themselves. And so kind of raising awareness around these issues of psychology and sociology, doing your own personal kind of healing work, and discovering that there are aspects of yourself that exist beyond these issues of egoic self-concern. This is the work. This is how we transform our situation into something that's actually sustainable and doesn't involve massive exploitation and unnecessary suffering. And I said that it can seem kind of far off, this idea that you'll have a functioning, free society once everyone's healthy enough to want that and to actually put it into action, rather than a top-down mechanism. The flip side of that is that if you agree with this perspective and you think that's what's important, is freedom, dismantling systems of domination, then we're actually already, you can find yourself in it today, because there is no endpoint. It's just a process. There's not going to be to think there could be a fixed endpoint of a perfect utopian free society, that comes from an instinct of control and wanting things to be a certain way. Whereas what we're talking about here is more like health. We're talking about a system that can flexibly adapt. There'll be some bumpy, periods, some better periods, some worse periods, but the system can, at least, it's not rigid and trying to control out of fear, but instead is flexibly adapting. And so one can live in that situation today. One can act as if one is already free and already challenge systems of domination. And even in the freer society, there would still be interpersonal situations where some people's instinct to dominate will come out. So you can imagine that we're already living in that society, but the domination is currently very, very huge. But so you can find yourself at the destination, and to do that, all one has to do is practice attempting to live as if one is free already, and support others who are being, attacked by the systems of domination, and attempt to dismantle them as best you can by whatever means you can. And so that's my overall stance on this stuff. I don't know how much that resonates with people in this audience, but this year I'll be talking to people who, as I've done over the last year, where their expertise in certain areas I see fitting into this overall framework. So if you're not convinced now, I'm hoping that showing how I see it all fitting together in my kind of honest perspective will at least give you a peek into a framework that I think is internally consistent, and makes sense, and isn't based on just some kind of knee-jerk, needing it to be a certain way, but is an honest inquiry into how we can move forward into a more sustainable situation where there isn't the kind of horrors of domination that we see today. Thanks for listening.